So in my time researching and learning about Pokemon, both as a fan and for this here YouTube channel, I've come across one thing that seems to be fairly consistent across Pokemon's entire history, and that is that with every new generation of Pokemon we get, there seems to be some kind of event that, if it were to have happened, would have completely changed that Pokemon generation forever. Game Freak just throw around a lot of ideas when it comes to making every new set of Pokemon games, and some big ones just get tossed in the trash, never to become a real thing, but had they have been, it would have resulted in a completely different Pokemon experience, and that is a lot of fun to think about, which is why we're going to be talking about it today. In today's video, I am simply going to be discussing how every single Pokemon generation out there, 1 through 8, could have been completely different in one way or another. Whether your favorite games are Gold and Silver in Generation 2 or Black and White in Generation 5, there are things that have happened within every generation that, if they had happened, would have completely changed that experience that you know and love from those games. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and take a look. Now, usually I do these things in chronological order, going from generations 1 to 8, but you know what, I feel like switching it up this time, so we're gonna go in no particular order and start with Generation 2. Now, Generation 2 is my personal favorite generation, so hearing about how it could have been completely different to the awe-inspiring game I know and love is really intriguing, but it's not necessarily a bad thing either. Generation 2, aka Pokemon Gold and Silver, have been the subject of a number of huge leaks recently that I have covered extensively on this channel, so there's no secret that Gold and Silver could have been completely different to the way we know them today. However, one element of these games and their original form that seems to get swept under the rug a lot of the time is the fact that they were more so intended originally as true sequels to Pokemon Red and Blue. Now, the final games themselves are sequels to Pokemon Red and Blue because they take place 3 years afterwards and sort of continue the events, but they're what I like to call pseudo-sequels. You're not necessarily following the exact same cast of characters and continuing right where you left off in Red and Blue. You're starting in a completely new region with a completely new set of characters, so while the stories are kind of related, kind of intertwined, and kind of continued, they're sort of different at the same time. However, it seems to be the case that Gold and Silver were originally following the source material that came before them in Red and Blue a lot more closely, and that these games were going to be much more true standard traditional sequels as opposed to indirect ones. This is because the games were originally called Pocket Monsters 2 Gold and Silver before eventually dropping the 2 and just calling themselves Gold and Silver, which I think is extremely indicative of the fact that they were going to be more direct sequels, but there is plenty more evidence to suggest that this was the intention. In the aforementioned beta leak that I talked about earlier, there are also plenty of other elements in the game that seem to carry over much more directly from Red and Blue than in the final game, such as Professor Oak still being the professor of the game. You also have Blue, his grandson, being his assistant, and actually heavily referencing the events of the previous game and the times that he had with the player character Red. You also have Giovanni, who was going to be a member of the Elite Four at one time, which heavily suggests a massive change in direction for the story that would have been very, very interesting to see. Is he in the Elite Four because he's a good guy now, or is he in the Elite Four because he took it over with the help of Team Rocket? Whatever the case may be, it very much seems to be that Game Freak was going to pick up in Gold and Silver right where they left off in Red and Blue originally, as opposed to what we got in the final game, where it was kind of a sequel, but sort of its own story as well. This definitely would have made the Gen 2 games completely different, and as much as I absolutely adore the Johto titles, I gotta admit, I would have loved to have played this original version with this original story as well. Next up, because once again we're not going in any particular order, I am going to jump from Generation 2 to Generation 5 and talk about Pokemon Black and White and Black and White 2. These games are obviously very polarizing, which is very fitting for the theme they have, and even though we don't really know a whole lot about the background and beta development of these games like we do for the Johto titles, there is one thing in particular that's really interesting that I wanted to touch on here. It seems to be the case that N's Rubik's Cube thing that he has hanging from his pants in his official artwork was going to be way more significant to the story than it is in the final game, which is absolutely nothing. It has no significance at all in the final game. However, despite this, there is concept art of this mysterious cube that shows it from a number of different angles. It shows it opening up and overall paints it as very, very important instead of a literal decoration to his outfit like it is in the actual game. Now, I am aware that games like Pokemon are developed in such a way that a lot of details like this are thought out, and even if it's not intended to be an actual part of the game, it will be developed as if it is, just for the sake of being thorough and giving everything a good backstory. However, with as little as we know, it's also just as possible that this was going to be a very significant object within the plot of Pokemon Black and White, and with Pokemon Black and White being so story-focused anyway, I can only imagine what that would have entailed. I think another piece of evidence that also points towards this idea is the fact that in N's Pokemon Black and White artwork, the Rubik's Cube thing is very much in the forefront of the artwork. It's almost as it's coming towards you with the angle that N's body is at. However, if you look at his newer artwork from Pokemon Black and White 2, this mysterious cube is very conveniently no longer visible because it sits on the left side of his body, which is farthest away from our perspective, where he's looking over his right shoulder in this new artwork, which completely obstructs our view of the cube. This says to me that when the original Black and White was in development, when this artwork was created, this cube was a lot more significant. But then by the time Black and White 2 rolled around and we already had the final story from Black and White finalized, obviously its presence is no longer seen because its presence in the plot was cut from the game by the time the original games finally came out. I mean, that pretty much is just a theory, but if it is indeed true in any way and this thing was going to play a big part in the story of the Unova titles, it obviously could have took it in a monumentally different direction for as important as it seems, which would have shaken up the Unova experience quite a bit. Now I think I want to jump to the other American-inspired region in Pokemon, and that would be Alola and Generation 7, and there is a possibility that Generation 7 was going to be completely different and would have completely altered the entire Pokemon franchise forever. This, once again, is another theoretical piece of conjecture, but it is one of my own creation, and I feel really strongly that this is indeed the case. So I made a video a little while back talking about how I believe that Pokemon Human Fusion was originally going to be an actual thing in the main series Pokemon games and was going to debut as the big main feature of Pokemon Sun and Moon, just like we saw with Mega Evolution for Pokemon X and Y. If you would like the full in-depth explanation, you can go check out that video with the card on screen, but basically there's a ton of evidence to suggest that something fusion related was going to happen in these titles. First up, we have the Pokemon Rebirth manga, which you may have heard about, which came about slightly before the Gen 7 timeframe, that literally centered completely around Pokemon Human Fusion. That is what it was all about. We even saw fusion in the Gen 5 games with Black Kyurem and White Kyurem, and granted, it wasn't human-based, it was still fusion. It shows that Game Freak had this on their minds. And then towards the end of Gen 6 and the start of Gen 7, we saw Ash Greninja, which is literally a fusion of Ash and Greninja. It technically is like their bond, quote unquote, but I mean, it's literally Greninja with Ash's physical features, like it's a fusion. And then, in Pokemon Sun and Moon distinctly, we see Pokemon Human Fusion again with Lusamine fusing with Nihilego. Like, that is something that just cannot be disputed. We also see some of the Ultra Beasts like Pheromosa and Nihilego and Xurkitree that look heavily, like very much like some of the key characters from Sun and Moon, like Lusamine, Lily, and Guzma. So with all of this other fusion stuff going on, I wouldn't be surprised at all if this was indicative of some kind of fusion mechanic that was just reworked into the alien-like Ultra Beasts that we know from the final game. And this actually ties back around into Pokemon Rebirth, where it all started really well, because in that manga, there are these little crystal things that help the people fuse with the Pokemon that look very identically like Z crystals from Pokemon Sun and Moon. So, as that game likes to say, it just all comes together. And if that wasn't enough for you, we also see Lusamine's role in Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, the enhanced versions of Sun and Moon, completely change, and she doesn't fuse with Nihilego at all. Almost as if they took that part out of the game in the enhanced versions once they had determined once and for all that fusion was not going to be the main feature of this generation. This feature has always been very intriguing yet terrifying for many Pokemon fans, and many have wondered if we would ever see this feature for real in Pokemon. And it seems like, even though it didn't happen, it was very close to being a reality before Game Freak pulled the plug, which obviously would have made things very different. Next up, I'm going to go back a couple generations and talk about Generation 4 and the Sinnoh region, which we are now currently revisiting with 2 brand new games that are coming out within the next year. And one of the most interesting things about the Sinnoh games that not a lot of people seem to talk about is the fact that they are basically leftovers from Generation 2. It's like they took all of the cut content from Pokemon Gold and Silver and made a game out of that, and that is what Pokemon Diamond and Pearl became. Now obviously that's not completely true for all of the content in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, but a lot of the content there, it is true, because if you go back and look at those beta leaks for Gold and Silver that we mentioned earlier, there is a ton of stuff in those beta leaks that eventually appeared in the Sinnoh games. We got to see a ton of Sinnoh Pokemon that were originally going to be Johto Pokemon, but were scrapped from Gold and Silver and recycled for Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, like Mime Jr., Tangrowth, Burmy and Wormadam, Leafeon, and more. There were also some cut towns from the original build of Gold and Silver that ended up making their way into the Sinnoh region, which is the kind of thing that is almost unheard of. But sure enough, if you look at these maps from the Gold and Silver beta leak, they very clearly resemble Canalave City and Snowpoint City from the Sinnoh games. This most likely explains why Johto and Sinnoh have a very close relationship to one another and have a lot of crossover content, because originally a lot of their content came and was intended for the same source in the original version of Pokemon Gold and Silver. So if Pokemon Gold and Silver pretty much stayed on track and did what it always intended to do from the beginning, then Pokemon Diamond and Pearl would have been crazy different, because they wouldn't have had that much content that was left over to pull from. And while Pokemon Gold and Silver were originally going to be the last Pokemon games, so we can't even really say if Pokemon Diamond and Pearl would have even existed at that point, with all of the millions of copies that those games sold, I think the Sinnoh games would have eventually happened one way or another and would have been just drastically different. I also wanted to bring up with this generation the massive amounts of gender differences that were cut from Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. It was revealed in a leak of those games that originally the gender differences mechanic was going to be on a much larger scale and was going to include most of the Pokemon, and that obviously would have changed the experience of these games dramatically, in addition to the rest of the Pokemon games in the future, because this feature would have been such a bigger part of the overall scope of the series than it is now if they had went with this original plan. So those are just a couple ways that the Sinnoh games could have been completely different. But now we're going to move on to talk about some of the other generations and how they could have been completely different. However, we're going to be doing that over on the UCast Studios gaming channel, as this is a part of our weekly crossover series with that channel where I do some of my more podcast-esque videos. So be sure to click the link in the description below to check out that second part. It really helps out this channel directly and just means a whole lot. So I will see you guys over there, and I will also see you here very soon for another video as well. And so until then, as always, I love you guys. Thank you for watching, and I will smell you guys later.